World Oppression and the Power of Transformation, a lecture by John Van Eenwyk, presented by the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago on October 12, 1991.
I've known John Van Eenwyk, and this startled me when I thought about it last night, for over 13 years. During that entire time, John has always impressed me as a devoted investigator of the shadow. More than anyone else in the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts, John has been the gadfly. Outspoken, daring, provocative, persistent, confrontive, and courageous. If he smelled shadow in our group, he would not hesitate to say, "Something stinks," even at the risk of drawing fire and being hit. But let me hasten to add that this same critically discerning eye is turned equally upon himself. I have always known John to be a devoted and rigorous investigator of his own shadow as well. This, I think, is rare and remarkable. He has a ferocity of observation that leaves no stone unturned, no defense unexamined, no demon unchallenged. Equally matched with this unrelenting pursuit of the shadow is a wonderful and good heart that makes him a real friend. He'll tell you the truth about you as he sees it, and then he'll stand by you. John also brings this rather unique kind of generosity to the wider community in his work with the victims of torture, and even with their torturers as well. John Van Eenwyk, who was one of, if not the, spearheading force behind the creation of the Kovler Center for the Victims of Torture here in Chicago, is now one of the world's leading authorities on the psychology of torture. His work is making a significant contribution to the effort to peer into this nightmare of the soul, deny the impulse to flee in horror, and approach it with the strength of will to seek to transform it. His work opens on the wider world of geopolitical shadow dynamics, yet never ignores the individual person crushed in its awesome and insane machinery. The Chicago Jungian community is indeed fortunate to count him among its members. Would you please give a warm welcome to John Van Eenwyk.
It's a very humbling thing to hear yourself described by various people and have the consistent impression that you're not the kind of person you think you'd like to know. Today's lecture is on world oppression and the power of transformation, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being here today. First of all, 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning is not a great time to get out of bed and do much of anything. And secondly, there are times to reflect on and analyze shadow, and there are times to participate in it or witness it. And I think we're in one of those times where witnessing it, experiencing it, is actually more important than reflecting on it. I had thought of bringing a widescreen TV here today and just letting us all sit back and watch what's going on in Washington, where our elected representatives, who a couple of years ago voted themselves immune from the regulations on sexual harassment, now find the hot potato dumped in their laps. Yet one more proof for the existence of God, as far as I'm concerned. Some would say the shadow, but I think they're relatively equivalent. And I also would like to thank you, because what I'm talking to you about today is not a dry academic exercise for me. It's something that comes from my own personal heart and soul for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm fascinated by the subject. It's my own will to power, which we've heard a lot of over this course of this conference is something that years ago I decided rather than trying to eliminate, I would just give it certain domains in which it could do whatever it wanted, one of which is the squash court, and the other is in the treatment of torture survivors and the investigation of what torture is. But it's also personal in the sense that in 1985, 86, my wife and I were on vacation with another couple, and we were visiting some Mayan ruins in Belize, Shenantonich, if any of you have been there. And from the top of the highest ruin, we could see into Guatemala, and we thought, well, why not go into Guatemala for a couple of hours and see what it's like? And at the cost of our passports and licenses, which we had to leave at the border, we were allowed to cross over for 2 horas. And while we were there, we stopped and had a beer at a little roadside comestable, little food restaurant, food store. And the people were very nervous about our presence. And I picked that up immediately, being ENFP, and thought to myself, well, okay, they're nervous because we're gringos, and I understand. But what we didn't know was that the Army was in the area that day. And when the Army is in the area in Guatemala, especially in the Mayan areas of Guatemala, you're in deep shit. It's a bad situation. And around the corner came a large truck, flatbed truck, filled with teenagers in fatigues with M16s, Mack truck, and drove past us. And we didn't think much of it, but we got into the car afterwards and started driving in generally the same direction of the truck. And we rounded a curve, and there was the truck in front of a Guatemalan farmhouse. And all the people from the farmhouse were in the front yard, and all the guns were trained on the people in the front yard. And the head of this group, the man who was in charge, was escorting at gunpoint, obviously the father of the family, down back behind the house. Well, I wanted to stop the car, get out, walk up to these people and say, I'm Senator Van Eenwyk from the United States, and I'm doing a fact-finding tour, and I'm just curious as to what's going on here. Fortunately, my grandiosity was offset by the wisdom of the other people with me who said, we're not supposed to see this. And I said, yes, that's probably right. So we drove on, and we waited out in the bush for 20 minutes to a half an hour, figuring we'd try to wait till it blew over, because this incident now existed between us and the border, and our time was running out. We had to get back. So after half an hour, we drove back, and as we passed the farmhouse, the yard was completely deserted. There was not a soul to be seen, except a little girl of about 5 years old, looking through her fence directly into our eyes as we passed, and she was crying. And as we passed, my heart broke, and I felt like the worst coward in the world. Much of what I have done since then could be charitably described as conversion reaction, and today's lecture is for her. In October of 1918, Carl Jung, in his preface to the second edition of On the Psychology of the Unconscious, which is the first of the essays in 2 essays, volume 7, wrote the following. From the many communications I have received after the publication of the first edition, I have discovered that even among the wider public, interest in the problems of the human psyche is very much keener than I expected. This interest may be due in no small measure to the profound shock which our consciousness sustained through the World War. One of the horrifying things about this preface is the phrase, the World War, which is now known as the First World War. The spectacle of this catastrophe threw man back upon himself by making him feel his complete impotence. It turned his gaze inwards, and with everything rocking about him, he must needs seek something that guarantees him a hold. Too many still look outwards, some believing in the illusion of victory and of victorious power, others in treaties and laws, and others, again, in the overthrow of the existing order. But still too few look inwards, to their own selves, and still fewer ask questions whether the ends of human society might not best be served if each man tried to abolish the old order in himself, and to practice in his own person and in his own inward state those precepts, those victories which he preaches at every street corner, instead of always expecting these things of his fellow men. Every individual needs revolution, inner division, overthrow of the existing order, and renewal. But not by forcing them upon his neighbors under the hypocritical cloak of Christian love or the sense of social responsibility or any of the other beautiful euphemisms for unconscious urges to personal power. Individual self-reflection, return of the individual to the ground of human nature, to his own deepest being with its individual and social destiny. Here is a beginning of a cure for the blindness which reigns at the present hour. 1918. This is why we have what many of you may recognize as a fractal attractor up here, which is one of my fascinations from another life that I live. And a fractal attractor is basically the graph of an equation that's been worked on itself for a long period of time. This is the graph, and they fold in on themselves in very spectacular fashion. And today's lecture intends to fold these various things in on themselves. That is, we're talking about world oppression. We're talking about how it comes about. We're talking about what you can do about it at the macrocosmic level, which, because we are Jungians, is completely related to what you do about it at the microcosmic level, which is what you do with it in yourself. And what you do with it in yourself leads to what you will do with it in the world. So in this convoluted interfolding and coming back to the same spot over and over again, please remember that that's the point of this lecture. In order for me to explain to you my understanding of the psychodynamics of oppressive societies, I want to begin by telling you what my impression of the shadow is. One of the wonderful things about being a Jungian is that we are all supposed to be individuated, which means we come to our own understanding of these things. So ask any two Jungians about something and they'll disagree because they both have their own individual view. So my view of the shadow can be completely different from somebody else's view of the shadow, and yet it's still okay. And when people come up to me with their fingers in the text and say, aha, but right here in volume 9, section 2, paragraph 344, Jung says, I can turn, and in the words of the master say, well, thank God I'm Van Eenwyk and not a Jungian. So we can get away with a lot in this field. So let me get away this morning with telling you my understanding of persona and shadow, because I don't think we can really adequately address shadow with regard to collective society without also looking at persona. Now, the development of the persona and the shadow takes place as a result of the interactions between the individual and the environment, which begins, of course, quite early in life. In my own personal experience with my children, in the first minute of life and from then on. And what the child learns is that they have a certain number of needs that need to be fulfilled, some of which the surrounding is perfectly capable and willing to fulfill, and others which it is not. And in the conflict between the individual's own need and the reluctance or inability of the environment to provide it, comes a tension, a conflict that generates the dawning, basically, of consciousness. One has to become aware of what it is in order to be able to address it. So we have a situation where throughout our lives we are constantly, in Piaget's terms, either accommodating ourselves to the environment or assimilating the environment into ourselves. And it's this accommodation which creates the persona. The persona becomes the means by which we get from the environment what we want and what we need. As Jung says, the persona is there to reveal and to conceal. It's the mask that we wear in order to get what we want and what we need. Now that inevitably means that we're going to take other dimensions of ourselves that are not useful in getting our needs met by the environment and throw them in the wastebasket of the psyche. These are not necessarily the awesome, fearful, horrible parts of our sides. They could simply be the sides that don't work, that aren't very useful. I think we all have an easier time confronting our deepest, darkest shadow than we do those things that just really aren't very useful, because there's really no reason to confront that. There's not even any fun in it. You can see what I view about all of this. Now, in that trash can are going to be a number of things. There are going to be very negative things that really don't work, one of which will probably be the inclination to murder those people who make life miserable for us. And these will be rightfully suppressed, although we will develop alternative forms of the same thing in a more highly sophisticated manner in the form of character assassination and backstabbing, this sort of thing. But there are also some very positive things down there in the shadow. There are good qualities that we have chosen for one reason or another not to actualize. One of the ones that a lot of us choose not to actualize is leadership potential, because we know what happens to leaders, and so we decided not to do that. If I'm running with the Latin kings down in Chicago, I'm going to want to put into my shadow a number of very humanitarian qualities that may not actually function well in that culture wherein I expect to get my needs met. So shadow can be positive and negative, and in fact, the very phrases positive and negative are functions of consciousness. As far as the unconscious is concerned, there's no positive, there's no negative, there's no up, down, left, right, there's no future, there's no past, there's no present. There simply is what is, and it's the ego that supplies these valences to the contents of the unconscious. Now, in speaking about shadow, I would like to differentiate three forms of shadow. The first form of shadow is what we could call the personal shadow, my shadow. We usually refer to this as a content, my power drive. My will to power is a part of my shadow. I don't necessarily like it as my public personality, so I suppress it. It's my shadow, okay? It's a noun. Then there's collective shadow, and collective shadow is the analog of that at the level of a culture or a society or a group. Again, it focuses on content, and it's a noun. As Jung said, we stare at the face of our shadow across the Iron Curtain. Collective shadow are those qualities attributed to other groups by a group that does not wish to recognize those qualities in itself. And again, we're speaking of contents, and we're speaking of nouns here. And then finally, and this is where I think the whole subject comes alive, at least for me, there is archetypal shadow. And archetypal shadow is form or dynamic. It's a verb. It is that within the psyche that generates movement away from what is into what can be. Those of you who are interested in anima and animus know that those are the counterparts of the persona that work in favor of the archetypal shadow. It's a verb. It's a transitive verb, and I am the object of the transitive verb. The archetypal shadow does to me. And of course, the subject of that sentence is what's really up for grabs, and where we all differ and go into all kinds of different pursuits in trying to figure out what the subject of that sentence is. But the archetypal shadow is the dynamic that does to me, okay? And it is definitely, according to Jung, the spur to growth. It gives us the potential to move beyond where we are. And psychological development for Jung is very clearly the integration of these shadow dynamics. And it's a very curious and I think a fun step to go from the personal shadow to the archetypal shadow when we realize that every time we can say, this is my shadow, it's not. Because if we can say that, it's conscious, so it's not shadow anymore. And somewhere down there, the scene has shifted, and we are yet to find out where that is. So we're always moving. And it also means that the shadow is an inherent destabilizer of the ego. And this is so important to what we're going to talk about today that I want to make a few quotations here, read to you a few quotations from Jung in Volume 7 about the destabilizing effect of the shadow on the ego and how essential that is to development, and how we cannot really participate in development until we recognize and appreciate that destabilization. Jung says in paragraph 251 of Volume 7, as the influence of the collective unconscious increases, so the conscious mind loses its power of leadership. Imperceptibly, it becomes led, while an unconscious and impersonal process gradually takes control. Thus, without noticing it, the conscious personality is pushed about like a figure on a chessboard by an invisible player. It is this player who decides the game of fate, not the conscious mind and its plans. And then he continues on in paragraph 252. The predominance of unconscious influence, together with the associated disintegration of the persona, and the deposition of the conscious mind from power, constitute a state of psychic disequilibrium, which in analytical treatment is artificially induced for the therapeutic purpose of resolving a difficulty that might block further development. That which occurs naturally in life can be concentrated and accentuated within the analytic context to speed the process up, so to speak. And then in the next paragraph, Jung says, hence I regard the loss of balance as purposive. It's not just something that disastrously happens, it's purposive, since it replaces a defective consciousness by the automatic and instinctive activity of the unconscious, which is aiming all the time at the creation of a new balance, and will, moreover, achieve this aim, provided that the conscious mind is capable of assimilating the contents produced by the unconscious, for example, of understanding and digesting them. What happens when the ego can't do this? And as you're listening to this explanation, we'll get into it a little more in a minute, but as you're listening to this explanation of what takes place at the level of the individual, translate it in your own mind to what takes place at the level of a culture or of a society. Okay? Failed development is the inability to recognize these destabilizing unconscious forces, the inability to recognize their positive value, again from the perspective of the ego, and their suppression back into the unconscious, and the clinging to what Jung called the regressive restoration of the persona. Now the problem is when unconscious contents come up and overwhelm us or take us by the throat, which they often do through the mediation of projection carriers in our environment, it's always a deeply humiliating experience. We realize that we are not who we thought we were, and we do not behave in the ways we thought we did, and we find ourselves brought back down to earth, the humus, the humiliation, the humility of being back on the earth rather than soaring high over all our conflicts where we would all much prefer to be. Jung describes the regressive restoration of the persona thusly. He says, a collapse of the conscious attitude is no small matter. It always feels like the end of the world, as though everything had tumbled back into original chaos. One feels delivered up, disoriented, like a rudderless ship that is abandoned to the moods of the elements. So, at least, it seems. In reality, however, one has fallen back upon the collective unconscious, which now takes over leadership. Once the unconscious contents break through into consciousness, filling it with their uncanny power of conviction, the question arises of how the individual will react. We're just following right along in his article in Volume 7 about this. This is paragraph 254. From the same paragraph, if he goes to pieces and laboriously tries to patch up his social reputation within the confines of a much more limited personality, doing inferior work with the mentality of a scared child, then technically speaking, he will have restored his persona in a regressive way. He will, as a result of his fright, have slipped back to an earlier phase of his personality. He will have demeaned himself, pretending that he is as he was before the crucial experience, though utterly unable even to think of repeating such a risk. Formerly, he wanted more than he could accomplish. Now he does not even dare to attempt what he has it in him to do. Quite frankly, I think in many ways American culture is at this stage of its psychological development. And then in paragraph 257 he continues, he will become smaller, more limited, more rationalistic than he was before. One could not say that this result would be an unqualified misfortune in all cases, and here he's referring to the analytic context and transference neurosis. For there are all too many who, on account of their notorious ineptitude, thrive better in a rationalistic system than in freedom. Freedom is one of the more difficult things. You get a sense of what it's like to have one's public image, so to speak, or that personality with which one gets one's needs met, suddenly crushed by an upwelling of unconscious forces, and rather than allowing one to be hurled along into a destiny not under one's own control, one clings desperately to the former identity and tries desperately to keep that former identity intact. I mean, we really are a powerful nation, aren't we? I mean, we really can determine policy. I mean, we won in Iraq, didn't we? You know, we did. Political editorial comment there. Now, oppression, as far as I'm concerned, is among the many other things that it is, a clear regressive restoration of the persona. When a culture, when a group, when a nation resorts to oppression, it is because something has appeared in their collective life that they cannot face, that they cannot integrate, that they cannot even explore without the fear that they will lose control over their own destinies. So they suppress that shadow, and they suppress anyone who embodies that shadow with every means available to them. As Hannah Arendt says in Crises of the Republic, page 95, for those of you who like to look these things up, the chief obsession of the totalitarian mind lies in its need for the world to be clear-cut and orderly. Any subtlety, contradiction, or complexity upsets and confuses this nature and becomes intolerable. Clear, cut, and orderly. No subtlety, no contradiction, no complexity, because it upsets and confuses this nature, the totalitarian mind. Collective control then becomes the means to assure personal security. Now, this takes the collusion, mind you, of all the people in the culture. I'm scared. I don't get it either. I want you to protect me. How come you're not doing something about this? And you'd better do something about this. And whatever means you have to take, I'll go along with because I'm scared. So let's do something as a nation, collectively. Let's do something about this problem. And I will comply. My personal security becomes ensured not by my ability to face what's going on in my own life and in my own unconscious, but by the power of the collective. And when this happens, you get a collective persona. And all collective personas are as rigid and unaccommodating as the number of people that participate in it. It's a lot easier for me to reshape my persona than to try to reshape the persona of the group to which I belong, because there are so many more there, and there's so much more of an investment in that persona. Unfortunately, according to the law of tensions of opposites, which is the cornerstone of Jung's theory, which says that whatever is one-sided in consciousness is offset automatically by archetypal shadow, that because of the tension of opposites, every amount of energy I put into shoring up my persona will activate an equivalent amount of energy in the unconscious. And what we get is one of those wonderful levers where the fulcrum is in the middle and the two weights are getting farther and farther and farther out on the ends of this lever, and until the lever is 3 miles long, and the slightest hair drop on one end or the other produces a chaotic tumbling of the whole thing. So in effect, regressive restoration of the persona empowers the shadow. And it empowers the shadow, in fact, in actuality, but also in the mind of the one regressively restoring the persona. So the more you get into that, the more frightened you become of those elements within yourself that are projected onto the environment that are out to destabilize you. Psychic energy invested in the persona creates an imbalance that is addressed by energy being attracted to the shadow and presented back to the ego as symbol, as projection. As Jung says, we don't make projections, we meet them. They walk up to us in the world. They're just embodiments of dimensions of ourselves. What then would the shadow of oppression be? Well, it's pretty easy. Arendt told us subtlety, contradiction, complexity, also flexibility, ambiguity, openness to others' points of view. The most dangerous person to an oppressive society is not the oppressor on the other side of the fence. Those people understand each other perfectly. They, after the war is over, they're the ones who have drinks together. It's those in the middle who are trying to keep the dialogue open. The Jacobo Timmermans of Argentina. These are the people who are the threat. The free press. These are the ones who are the shadow of oppression. So if there is projection and suppression of shadow, at the individual level, we call it suppression, and at the collective level, we must call it oppression. Oppression is the suppression of shadow within a group. The resulting persona bankruptcy and the shadow dominance that results from that, because the unconscious is always able to mobilize more power than the ego, results in a disaster for both sides. Again, Hannah Arendt, page 152 in Crises of the Republic. To substitute violence for power can bring victory, but the price is very high. For it is not only paid by the vanquished, it is also paid by the victor in terms of his own power. Thus we see the rage that oppressive cultures let loose on their own citizens as they enter that downward spiral of inevitable decay. So, we're all asking ourselves, what can we do? What are the psychological interventions? Well, I'd like to give you two. I'd like to give you two categories. First, individual. What can we do with individuals who have been tortured, who have suffered from oppression, which, given our world today, is the majority of the human population? And what can we do as a group? And what can we do as a group to the groups? Under individual interventions are basically analytic techniques and the encounter with the torturer itself. And under analytic techniques, there are two types. They're formal and they're interpersonal. The formal techniques are the temenos, the secured place. We, as Jungians, understand quite clearly the need for the safe place, the sacred, inviolable container in which people can experience whatever there is to be experienced with the cooperation and shared experience of another individual. A man I'm working with said to me once, you know, the cell was the only safe place. The only place where I was not tortured, the only place where I knew I would not be killed was in my cell. The analytic container has to become the cell, with all of the shadow implications of that. Secondly, among formal techniques is symbolic attitude. This is something that Jungians, I think, have more than anyone else. And as I go around lecturing to various groups in various countries, this is the one that really takes hold. This is the one that makes sense to people. The symbolic attitude in the treatment of torture survivors allows an attenuation of the trauma. That is, through the mediation of symbols, it's possible to work with the actual torture situation without calling it the torture situation. It's at once removed, so to speak. This is the beauty of dreams. Dreams and unconscious symbols can bring up in the present the actual living dynamics of the original problematic situation that then can be worked out between analyst and analysand without ever referring to the original situation. It's an absolutely marvelous thing to be able to do. The symbolic attitude also attributes the initiative and power in the healing to the unconscious. And this is an extraordinary revelation to torture survivors, that what is going on in their own unconscious, their nightmares, their sleep disorders, their paranoias, are actually their own power. Torture is not around anymore, it's gone. It is their own power trying to work out the situation on its own. That they are not being tortured and tormented by the torturer any longer. They are being tortured and tormented by their lack of understanding that their tortures and torments are seeking a way out of what happened. And finally, the interpretation of guilt in the symbolic attitude. That's a tough subject. I'm not going to get into it here, just to say that I think that a lot of survivor guilt, particularly with regard to torture survivors, occurs, first of all, because of those people who did not survive the process, whereas they did. And we can all understand that. Why was I the one? Why did I survive? It must be because I did something within my torture experience that saved me, that my compatriots were strong enough not to do. The problem being, of course, that those who do not survive torture don't tell what went on in their sessions, so nobody knows. It's all conjecture. But that kind of guilt. But also, we know from religion and from alchemy and from Jung that torture and suffering are integral parts of transformation. And that what is happening in the torture experience is that the representative of the oppressive society is trying as hard as possible to transform this threatening representative of the unconscious urge into something better, something that will help the culture to become more highly functioning. In other words, in torturing this person, I'm trying to assure myself that what I fear is happening is in fact not happening. Yet as I do it, it is confirmed to me that I'm completely caught in the very thing I'm trying to get rid of. It's like the Maupassant story of the Horla. It's just in me. My inability to transform this other person, the other person feels as well. They feel guilty because they somehow are the problem and because the torturer failed to remove them from being part of that problem. That's something that we're still working on, so you can take it as you like. In terms of interpersonal dynamics of the treatment of torture survivors, there's role reversal, the empowerment of the survivor. This is something that I think Jungian psychology is particularly good at doing, because in Jungian psychology, the patient is the expert. The analyst knows nothing. You know, people walk into our lives who have been dealing with these things for 43 years, and they say to us, "What do you think is going on?" They're the expert. They know what's going on. They don't know they know what's going on, but they have all the information needed for the transformation and the cure, and somehow they've got to tell us. They've got to educate us. With regard to torture survivors, one of the things we do immediately is we say, what was it like in your country? What was your house like? What was your family like? What was life like? What did you do during the day? What was your work like? What did you do? Tell me about it. Educate me. I need to know. Suddenly, for the first time, they're not being interrogated. You know, why does this bother you? How did you feel about your mother? You know, this kind of stuff. But they are telling us what's going on. They tell us their history. If they have dreams or fantasies, they are the ones who know what the symbols mean, not us. They are the ones who have the associations. People often will bring a dream to me and say, what do you think this means? Well, I don't know what it means. It's their dream. What do you think it means? And also, the patient is in control. They determine the direction and the pace of the therapy. This is something that Jungian psychology can offer to the treatment of torture survivors and all survivors of oppression that I think really is a gem. Secondly, under the interpersonal means of working with torture survivors is modeling. The analyst himself or herself must be the model for flexibility and openness. The ability to go along with what has happened to the torture survivor, to go along with whatever the survivor needs the analyst to be. Because people who are survivors of oppression have learned to shut down. They've learned not to go along. They've learned to keep a part of themselves intact and away from every experience they go into. And the analyst, by being completely open to the experience of the survivor, is a model for the survivor of how to do that. Analytic techniques are useful, but so is the encounter with the torturer. Because in the encounter with the torturer, the transference and the countertransference inevitably recapitulate the original experience of torture. One of the fascinating things of working with torture survivors is that it gives us the means of working with the torturer who tortured that survivor. Because the interactions with torture survivors and the sequela of torture have the ability to recapitulate the torture experience. Through projective identification, that is, through the torture survivor expecting us at some point to behave as the torturer, and our finding ourselves unconsciously doing so, we again gain access to the original experience. It's as if we as analysts have walked into the torture chamber to do exactly what's necessary in that situation. But this is not something that's being done in reminiscent. It's happening right now. It's an actual living presence in the work with the torture survivor. Now, of course, the projective identification of the survivor onto the analyst, onto the practitioner, is done in the shadow. It's done unconsciously. Because when the survivor comes into our offices, they see us as helpers and friends. And that's how we relate. We're together. We like each other. We're working together as helpers and friends. And in the shadow dynamic, where it's least noticeable, comes this recapitulation of the torture experience. And let me give you an example of this. This is under the individual treatment. At the Marjorie Kovler Center for the Treatment of Survivors of Torture, which is located here in Chicago, and is the only agency in Chicago working exclusively with torture survivors, and one of the few in the United States, and therefore one of the few in the world, One of the reasons that I'm a world's expert on the treatment of torture survivors is that there aren't very many of us. I am a big fish in an extremely small pond. There's not a lot of money in it. We had a case come up where a man was referred to us, the whole family, because their child had fallen in the bathtub and had been taken to the hospital for injuries, and the physicians in the emergency room recognized the injuries as symmetrical and recognized them then as probably caused by the parents. In other words, this child had been physically abused, and one of the really demonic things about torture is that it turns survivors into torturers also. We're not going to get too much into that. That's another shadow side of things. We don't have time for it today. But what happened was they then referred the whole family to the Kovler Center for treatment. Now, the problem with this was that if we found out that, in fact, the father or someone in the family had physically abused the child, we would have to report it to the authorities. That's law. We're all licensed. As part of our license, we have to do this. And of course, this is faced in areas other than torture treatment, obviously. But what could we do? We had a very lively discussion in our clinical meeting, and those who were on the side of disclosing said that in getting the survivor to disclose that, yes, in fact, he had beaten his daughter, if in fact that was true, he would be acknowledging his behavior, and he would be gaining insight into its determinants. This is a very basic premise of psychotherapy. Once we acknowledge what we're doing, we can begin to unravel why we do it. Secondly, that would increase his responsibility in the world and within the context of his family. Against reporting was the idea that the survivor might terminate therapy. I'm sorry, this is against discussing it in the therapy. That the survivor may terminate. That if we say to the survivor, look, we really want you to look into yourself and see if this happened, and if it happens, we want to know about it. The survivor may say, look, I'm going somewhere else, thank you very much, goodbye. Now that's faced in arenas outside torture treatment also. In favor of reporting it, were we to find out that it existed, was just the basic fact that we're legally required to do so. As licensed practitioners, we have to report these things. Secondly, they're there for the protection of the child. The child is equally as important as the survivor. So if the survivor admits to it, we must report it. Arguments against that were, if we report it, the child may be removed from the home. And here's a torture survivor who's already experienced tremendous trauma at the hands of a government agency, now being violated by another government agency yet again. And then, of course, the also against reporting it would be that the survivor may terminate therapy. Now, as we discussed this, I was doing the Jungian thing of what's the shadow? Where's the shadow? What's the part of this that recapitulates what we don't think it does? How are we, by even discussing all of this, how are we going to do the opposite of what we think we're going to do? And we came up with the rub, and that was that failing to report the abuse is a direct recapitulation of a critical dimension of the torture experience. And that is that the torturers make it very clear to the people they're torturing that the torturers are above the law. The law does not apply to them. They are the law. Torture is outlawed in all the countries where it's practiced. That's just fact. It's outlawed by international law, by the 1984 Geneva Convention, which the United States has yet to sign. We don't agree with it. We would be placing ourselves above the law, and we would be attempting to control the survivor. By trying to keep the survivor in therapy, we were trying to determine the behavior of the survivor. So we were, in effect, becoming, in one dimension, like the experience that had created the problem. Reporting the abuse, however, would give the survivor the power to leave. We would empower the survivor. They would have the decision what to do. That would then expose us as therapists to the same apprehension and anxiety, loss of control, that they experienced in the torture experience. The roles get reversed. Now we are the ones who are, in effect, under oppression by the torture survivor. This reversal of roles is very therapeutic in helping survivors to recover the power that they've lost. This can happen within institutions too. Parallel process goes on all over the place for those of you who are practitioners and know about things being recapitulated in supervisory experiences that were experienced in relations with the patient. This happens a lot in the institution. Well, now I would like to show you a couple of slides of an experience that I had working with torture survivors. Now, I'm not the kind of person who likes putting a camera in the face of people who are suffering and saying, let's preserve this on film for the greater glory of future lectures. So I have no pictures of people that I'm working with individually, but it was a little easier to take pictures of an entire culture where this is occurring. In May, I went over to the Gaza Strip, which is just around the corner from Egypt, to work in the Gaza Community Mental Health Center, which is the first mental health center in the Gaza Strip, serving 800,000 to 1 million Palestinians who have been and are right now under oppression. Now, let's see here. This is the Gaza Strip. It's on the Mediterranean Sea. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. These are fishing boats. Any of you who are boating aficionados will recognize the gracefulness of the sheer. Here again is another picture of the Mediterranean. This is a minaret. Of course, 90% of people in the Gaza Strip are Muslim. And one of the problems that occurs in the Gaza Strip is that as a result of oppression by the Israeli Defense Force, the group that has taken over are the right-wing Muslim fundamentalists, who, in my innocent and naive way of thinking, are as oppressive, particularly to women, as the Israelis are to the Palestinians. The gardens that you find throughout the desert in the Middle East. This is a garden in Gaza. This is a friend of mine, and next to him is a beautiful tree, but behind him is the Center for Israeli Security in the Gaza Strip. This building monitors every radio transmission, every telephone call, every fax transmission into and out of the Gaza Strip. And it's absolutely, totally against the law to take any photographs of these sorts of things. So I asked him to pose here so I could get a picture of him with this building in the background. I am a gadfly, you know. I mean, if somebody tells me not to do something, that's my piece of cake. This is different modes of transportation. A little boy has brought his goat to market with the horse-drawn carriage and the car in the foreground, but obviously the main point of this picture is the prison camp in the background, you can see. These are open air, out in the hot sun prison camps where people are imprisoned without charge. There's no requirement to file charges. Under military law, people can be detained for up to 6 months without charges and are. This is a picture of 55-gallon drums in the background that have been used to seal off all the streets around Gaza. So there's only one street in and out of the city, so that getting around from street to street is very difficult, particularly when someone is injured. If someone is injured either through an encounter with the Israeli Defense Force or any other reason, you can't get them very far, very fast, and the mortality rate is pretty high. This is the Palestinian flag, and the Palestinian flag is outlawed in Gaza. And I'm not going to tell you where this is, but it's the only one still there. And because the Palestinian flag has been outlawed, you can see it's been scraped off the wall in the back here of the market. The colors of the Palestinian flag appear everywhere, and the colors are green, red, black, and white. So virtually every sign in Gaza is in green, red, black, and white. And this is the population's attempt to not submit to the oppression that's there. This is the Gaza Community Mental Health Center. And Samir is the gentleman in the white shirt. He was my driver. They didn't want me walking around the streets of Gaza because they were afraid that I would be mistaken for an Israeli soldier and killed. But as my wife often tells me, any wasp with a turned up nose like mine could never be mistaken for an Israeli. So I really would not have much trouble. And after a while, I began to ditch my driver and just walk around. And the night watchman is in the middle, and a gentleman to the right is a young boy who would hang around the center. And that's the center in the background, not the gray structure, the white structure. Down the road from the center is this kind of a scene. You can see that things in Gaza have pretty much come to a halt. Construction has stopped. The economy is dead. The conditions are absolutely desperate. This is a view in the other direction. You can see the United Nations flag in the middle of the screen, and just to the right of that is a checkpoint for the Israeli Defense Force. If you walk or drive by that, you have to stop, present identification, show who you are, where you're going, why you're going there, this sort of a thing. This is the state of construction in the Gaza Strip. Everything has stopped. This is the Peter Mudd of the Gaza Community Mental Health Center. I was amazed that they have the exact same expression. This gentleman was an absolutely beautiful man. He's now in Boston for 3 months studying at BU, but he keeps the place running, and I think this is probably a universal human look by all those people who have to keep things running. This is one of the practitioners, Ahmed. The Palestinians were fascinated with Jung. They found Jung to be the best way of addressing the situation that they had so far, given the fact that the way of addressing the situation they had so far was primarily chemotherapy, was drug therapy, because when you're 8 people dealing with 800,000, drug therapy is the most expedient. Written behind him, again, you're not allowed to photograph this stuff, is if we are to die, we will die standing up, not on our knees. A kind of rebellious against the oppression. This is the oppressor. This is the Israeli Defense Force, who this day were keeping people away from the prison camp that you saw in the earlier picture. Obviously, this picture is totally illegal, but I managed to take it through my knees. I was sitting down and just sort of put the camera through my knees. What they're doing is they're keeping people away from the prison camp because this was the one day that you could bring your lawyer in for a writ of habeas corpus. And of course, if you can't get your lawyer there, you can't file for the writ. So no one was allowed beyond this point. And this is one of the machines that they use. This is used to break through roadblocks and break into houses and this sort of thing. You can see the water cannons on top. It's a very ferocious looking vehicle. The result of which is that the children all over Gaza have taken up the cause and with slingshots engage the Israeli soldiers wherever they can. And power lines all over Gaza have these slingshots hanging from them. They have slingshots and they are fired back upon with guns that have plastic bullets, which are round lead balls a centimeter in diameter covered in plastic that supposedly don't kill. But they have not really passed that test. And these are the terrorists. These are the children of the Gaza Strip. This is on the beach, and I was warned not to walk on the beach alone because I would be mistaken for an Israeli soldier. And I went down to the beach one day, and these guys came up to me, and they spoke to me in Arabic, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I really don't understand Arabic." And the guy on the left, the one who obviously is the well-fed one in the group, there's malnutrition all through the Gaza Strip. There is basically starvation because there's no money. He said to me, "You're English." And I said, "No, American." And he said, "American." He said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Chicago." At which point, one of these kids said, "Michael Jordan." And I said, "Yes." And from that moment, we were friends. And these are the kids then who, every time I went down to the beach, they had all kinds of questions. And these are the ones who are imprisoned. People from 10 years old and up are being imprisoned. These are also 2 young Gaza children who face the future that exists there now. We don't know where they will be. I had to have one picture of a child weeping in the doorway in one of the refugee camps. And here she is. And here is her brother posing her for the picture immediately before it. This was a complicity shot. And this was in beach camp. And this is beach camp. It's called beach camp because it's on a beach. And there are about 60 to 70,000 people living in this beach. And this is what they live in. These people are the ones who were expelled from Israel when it was created in 48. And this is where they were put temporarily. And it's been a number of years since temporarily was really defined, about 45 years. The problem with it is that if you have been shot by the Israeli Defense Force and are in a wheelchair, you can't get around because you can't take a wheelchair through sand. So this gentleman is confined to his home. That's his father and mother with him. I was invited into their home to hear the story, to get the background of what we were treating at the center. This is the Child Development Center. The gentleman in the white shirt is a clinical psychologist in charge of research, and this place is open because the owner is married to a woman from California. And the Israeli Defense Force will not close down any institution that has an American as part of it. for very, very obvious reasons. So they're protected, and they are the only child development center for the Gaza Strip, which again is about 800,000 people. And they deal with everything there: learning disabilities, blindness, deafness, physical handicaps. This is to show that I was really there, and also because I love Middle Eastern food, and that's it right there, and whenever I see it, I kind of go back and remember what it was like. And this again is actually backwards, interestingly enough, picture of a fractal attractor to get us back into what we're talking about. And I'd like to close by just mentioning something about what's going on in the Gaza Strip as an example of terrorism. What's happening today is that because individual torture leaves so many marks and can be tracked, paper trail in the United States lingo, organized violence is being used more and more. The large-scale psychological undermining of people's ability to carry on life. For example, in the Gaza Strip, there are restrictions on trade, travel, and education. There is universal censorship. There are no newspapers. Identification cards are required to be carried at all times, and you can be asked for them at any moment. Social services are outlawed. The building of settlements for Israelis in the Gaza Strip goes on. These are interesting, by the way. When you hear about the settlements being built in the Gaza Strip, you really should take a look at one of them sometime. Basically what they are is Russian Jews forced to live behind barbed wire, not allowed to go out, protected by guard towers. It's a political tool, and the people who are involved in it are living in concentration camps for Jews, established by Jews in the Gaza Strip. Water from the Gaza Strip is diverted into Israel. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45% of the water in the Gaza Strip goes to Israel. There are arrests at night without charges regularly, and those who are detained are tortured in the traditional way. Now, this is pretty upsetting, and what basically to me becomes most important about it is that the majority of the population of Israel is adamantly opposed to what's going on in the Gaza Strip. And I'm going to explain in a moment why it can happen. And the bottom line of all of this is that we all have within ourselves the ability to torture and to oppress. We do it to ourselves regularly, and we do it to those around us, in more highly sophisticated terms, of course. But that there is, within every oppressive culture, a large group of people mediating against the oppression, and they are the ones that the oppressors of both sides hate. And the oppressors on both sides, at least at the macrocosmic level, are in the minority, and they are usually terrorists themselves. And the people in the middle who are trying to get it reversed are the ones who take the rap. The Palestinians and the Israelis in this situation are the shadows of one another, without any question. Jung said in volume 11, paragraph 85, the following, which I really think is pretty accurate. Since everybody is blindly convinced that he is nothing more than his own extremely unassuming and insignificant conscious self, which performs its duties decently and earns a moderate living, nobody is aware that this whole rationally organized conglomeration we call a state or a nation is driven on by seemingly impersonal, invisible, but terrifying power which nobody and nothing can check. This ghastly power is mostly explained as fear of the neighboring nation. The Israelis are convinced that the Palestinians want to do them in. The Palestinians are convinced that the Israelis want to do them in. So I'll read this sentence again. This ghastly power is mostly explained as fear of the neighboring nation, which is supposed to be possessed by a malevolent fiend. Since nobody is capable of recognizing just where and how much he himself is possessed and unconscious, he simply projects his own condition upon his neighbor, and thus it becomes a sacred duty to have the biggest guns and the most poisonous gas. And this is where I think Jung is right on the money. The worst of it is that he is quite right. All one's neighbors are in the grip of some uncontrolled and uncomfortable fear, just like oneself. The Palestinians do want to eliminate the state of Israel. In lunatic asylums, it is a well-known fact that patients are far more dangerous when suffering from fear than when moved by rage or hatred. Now, in the last 5 minutes here, I want to explain a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder and the cycle of oppression. because this is what happens in these kinds of situations. We know that one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, a terribly inadequate diagnosis, but the only one we have for these sorts of situations, one of the symptoms is hypervigilant. People become hypervigilant about anything that could hurt them. They become anxious about their security, they become suspicious, and they become vulnerable, as a result of which they wish to get rid of their shadows, which could destabilize them and get them moving in a different direction. The appeal of oppression is that it guarantees the suppression of the threat. When Shamir comes into a government that represents people who have been through the Holocaust and says, I can protect you, they generally think it's not a bad idea. Not a bad idea at all. Someone's got to do it. The threat can be suppressed, events can be controlled, and identity can be consolidated. In other words, we're headed toward a regressive restoration of the persona in the face of the shadow. What happens then? Those whom the one who guarantees security behaves toward become themselves oppressed. Shamir comes in and does in the Gaza Strip the same kind of oppression that people are afraid the Palestinians will do to them. The trauma becomes enforced on others. There is a consolidation of the opposition, the Hamas, the Intifada gets going, and there is a hypervigilance on the part of those oppressed. Now the Palestinians are hypervigilant. The shadow has become empowered. What happens then? Somebody comes up to the Palestinians and says that we can protect you from the Israelis. And we will do it by doing to them what we're concerned they're going to do to us. Flexibility, openness, compromise are seen as traitorous. Extremism is encouraged. The shadow is suppressed and empowered. And as Arendt says, to quote her again, to substitute violence for power can bring victory, but the price is very high. For it is not only paid by the vanquished, it is also paid by the victor in terms of his own power. The frightening thing about all of this, as far as I'm concerned, is that under oppressive societies and after oppressive societies have been defeated, it is the people who were working toward moderation who are always the victims. These are the ones who are eliminated. And the extremists go on to fight another day, because that's the game they play. They know how to play it, and they play it very well. A society that is totally immersed in the feminine, holding, incubating, nurturing, nourishing, is totally vulnerable to the society possessed by the masculine, penetrating, erect, fertilizing with its own ideas the other culture. We will end with Jung, volume 18, paragraph 313. Whatever we fight about in the outside world is also a battle in our own inner selves. For we must finally admit that mankind is not just an accumulation of individuals utterly different from one another, but possesses such a high degree of psychological collectivity that in comparison the individual appears merely as a slight variant. How shall we judge the matter fairly if we cannot admit that it is also our problem? Anyone who can admit this will first seek the solution in himself, and this, in fact, is the way all great solutions begin. What can we do? First, we can model openness and flexibility at all levels. The way we run our institutions, the way we run our families, the way we run our governments. We can develop as an institute, the Jung Institute of Chicago, the analytical psychology movement worldwide, our own persona power, committed to the unrestricted potential for development of all people, even when it means facing the shadow. We can use paradoxical intent. We can let oppressive nations of the world know that we are ready to receive anyone they expel, that the efforts of torturers in fact contribute to the building of the international community that opposes them, that we are ready to treat the people that they abuse, and we are ready to turn that group into a community of which we belong, that will oppose anything further with regard to regressive restoration of the persona on the part of societies. And finally, we can use a kind of paradoxical intent whereby we educate people to understand the fallacies of what they're doing. The Freudians did this very interestingly with regard to philanderers who they described as suppressed homosexuals. More than one man stopped philandering for fear of being a homosexual. It was widely disseminated a few years ago that men who exposed themselves in public were really insecure about the length of their phallus. And after that was released in a public relations campaign in the Boston area, the incidence of exposures in public dropped dramatically. When was the last time you heard the song, "I Want a Girl Just Like the Girl Who Married Dear Old Dad"? There's not a singer in this country who would dare sing that today. Let's do the same with oppression. Let's do the same with torture. Let's plant it in the subconscious of the minds of our leaders that any time they take an extremist line, they are showing their own terror of what exists within themselves, and that the rest of us see through it and are laughing because of it. We have a lot of work to do. I thank you very, very much for being here this morning to share in what I've been doing.
Anyone have a question or a comment?
I'd like some clarification. It seemed that you were suggesting or identifying moderation with the feminine and extremism with the masculine, and also identifying powerlessness with moderation and femininity, and strength with masculinity and the ability to penetrate. That's all kind of confusing and problematic for me.
I think that that's one of those areas where, fools rush in, but, angels fear to tread. My own view on the subject is that any time an individual or a group gets skewed completely into what we culturally, what I, as a member of this culture, tend to identify with the masculine or the feminine, we're in trouble. That in fact, masculine and feminine have to exist side by side with one another. There's no implicit identification with the feminine as vulnerable, except insofar as the sense is the feminine is that which becomes penetrated. And if that which is inclined to penetrate the feminine is of ill intent, there is a vulnerability there that could conceivably be seen as weakness. If you have a culture that in no way attempts to defend itself in a masculine, phallic, yang way from the cultures around it, it will be overrun. We've seen examples of that in history. This is not to identify the feminine with weakness except in the presence of the unyielding masculine. Does that help at all?
Well, it seemed, I guess my problem is how to allow the feminine then to penetrate into the masculine culture.
The feminine doesn't penetrate, the masculine penetrates.
Are you sure?
No. No. That's what I feel.
Well, I just think that maybe that's what the problem is that we're talking about, is perhaps that the feminine conceives of itself as unable to penetrate, and so does not, feels itself defenseless, and so does not defend itself. And it seems to me that the end of your to-do model is suggesting that the feminine must in fact penetrate and assert.
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay,
no.
Explain your model.
Boy, okay. Actually, this is the kind of question I prefer to answer after I've had a couple of beers, because it's a tough question. Let me say it this way. I think that with regard to any functioning entity, be it an individual or a culture, there are masculine dimensions and feminine dimensions. I think the power of the masculine is in its ability to penetrate. I think the power of the feminine is in its ability to contain and to incubate. That without the two operating side by side, you have inadequate power. You have sterility, in effect. There is no coming together of opposites in a new thing. So with regard to the idea of how do we set up this model, an aggressive phallic yang campaign on behalf of the ability to be open and accommodating is, to me, a good combination of masculine and feminine, is what we need to do. Does that help at all?
It's an interesting formulation.
I'll be at the banquet tonight. Catch me after the second beer, and we'll go into it. Yeah.
Okay. Lois, I don't know that this is going to reach. Can you come around a little bit?
As I understand Lois's question, the question is something to this effect. Given the variety of responses with regard to torture survivors to the torture experience, can we look to the differences in the survivor themselves in terms of their connection with the transcendent? Is it in the techniques of torture? What accounts for the sequelae of torture and their variety from person to person? Is that close? Okay. This is a very, very hard question, Lois, because one of the most difficult things that is something none of us wants to face in terms of shadow work is what makes it possible for some people to survive torture and other people not to. And one of the things that we've discovered is that there's a bit of shadow here, that oftentimes that which allows a person to survive torture is something that would not be considered adaptive in other circumstances. That they have a sense of what's going on, and they're tougher than the torturer. My feeling very clearly is on the side of people like Bruno Bettelheim and Viktor Frankl, who say that suffering without meaning is intolerable. And those people who find meaning in suffering tend to survive suffering better than those who don't. We know that in the concentration camps in World War II, the group that had the highest survival rate were the Jehovah's Witnesses, who definitely belong to that school of theology that says, the more I suffer, the more I share in Christ's redemption of the world, which could be seen from a psychological point of view as a beautifully passive-aggressive response to the oppression. In other words, give me more. Give me. You are absolutely leading to my greater glory in being with Christ, not in heaven, but here, right now. So I don't know. As I say, I'm a very big fish in a very small pond, and the research isn't totally in. I think it's absolutely essential that people have a connection with the transcendent. Their religion helps them tremendously. It certainly helps in working with them afterwards. But that also there are personality dynamics that can get generated early in life that could be seen as pathological that actually help a person to survive torture quite well. Okay. We have a couple over here.
Could you speak a little about gender differences in survival between male and female survivors of torture?
No, I really can't. I don't know anything about it. I'm sorry. In my personal experience, it's about the same. There's a very good book written by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which talks about a lot of this. It's called The Breaking of Bodies and Minds, and it may be for sale in the bookstore. I asked them to order it in advance, but that's probably the most complete study of this done so far. Yeah.
As a Jewish American woman psychotherapist who's involved with the Jungian Institute, I want to say that I feel very uncomfortable with this discussion about Israel and Gaza, and it is filled, obviously, with shadow implications on many sides. And I would like some deeper discussion, and we're not, obviously, we don't want to go into a political discussion at this point, and I certainly don't want to, but I think that we have to be sensitive about what type of ground is being tread on, even to the issue of the turned up nose, which is a big issue in the Jewish culture. And I think we are all filled with our shadow and our stereotypes about these cultures, and I just wanted to put that out to you.
Sure, I appreciate that. The important thing about the Gaza Strip to remember is that people are being tortured there. Now, the reasons for that are what people want to debate. The fact is absolutely not disputable. And what I am opposed to are any discussions that in any way legitimize the continuation of torture in any form whatsoever. Now, the comment about the turned up nose was made by my Jewish wife, who, when I got back from the Gaza Strip, wrote a letter to George Bush and said, I approve of your policy opposing continued settlements in the occupied territories. And she sent copies to all of the senators, one of whom wrote back and said, thank you very much for your letter. You can be assured that I will support Israel on every vote in the Congress. And what she figured was that the staff had read the first line of the letter, which was, I am an American Jew, and fired out form letter 257. And so she wrote back and said, I'm not sure you quite understood what my letter was about. Would you please respond to it? And there, of course, has been no response forthcoming. So these are, of course, touchy issues. There's not a country in the world where it is not felt that there is a reason, a valid reason to torture, but I will not buy it.
Comment. George Kennan, in the second book I think that he wrote about international affairs, said that it is impossible to look in the eyes of a KGB without seeing there the seeds of his own destruction.
Yeah.
And then his was the policy of containment,
Yeah.
which, okay, is feminine, right?
Right.
I wonder if you have any comments about the future of what was the KGB. I understand within the last 2 days they've been dissolved. It has been dissolved. And there are now 3 different sections, one for border guards, one for international espionage reporting, and one for internal espionage. Do you have any system that would fit in predicting what will happen to?
Yes, oh yes, absolutely. They will endure. The KGB, the CIA, any secret police society is generated by and approved by those who are afraid. And those who are afraid are those who are afraid that what is welling up inside of themselves to move them along the course of their own personal development is really a function of the environment. And in order to gain greater security, they will allow the environment to protect them from what they fear is in the environment, which is really in themselves. So the KGB will just simply endure, as does the CIA, as does the National Security Council, and they endure because we need it. Okay? That's, you know, we allow it, right? And those of us who speak out against it are always seen as weird or strange. Well, kind of charmingly naive. Good ideas, but you know, it doesn't really work. You know, let's face it, there are really very real dangers here. And what Jung is saying, absolutely right. There are very real dangers here. But people don't identify them with themselves. Yes, please.
But the policy of containment did work.
Oh, could the policy of containment work?
No, she said the policy of containment did work.
Did work. A friend of mine sees the policy of containment as having been subordinate to the poker game that Reagan and Gorbachev were playing with regard to defense spending, and that in fact Russia threw in the hand, but we don't have any cards either, and the pot is empty. So I don't know. That's international politics. That's I don't know.
I think we could take one more question, then we'll break.
We have one down here.
I was just wondering if any of the torturers in the Gaza Strip have shifted their position and actually wanted treatment.
Yes, they have. There's a great deal of literature on what's happening in the Gaza Strip written by Israelis. Israelis who have served in the Israeli Defense Force, as they are required to do as reserve officers, decrying what they had to do and asking for help with what it did to them. Yes, absolutely. There are a number of people who were put in the position of having to follow orders, of having to do what they are told to do, or they would face very dire circumstances, and they have come forward. That is in the literature.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Please come back in 20 minutes.
Thank you.